Hey guys, I'm Norb.
And I'm Mike.
And we are the Watchmen.
The men who watch.
If it's on a screen, we're talking about it, watching it, and sharing our thoughts about it with you guys.
Today we are going to review the top 5 war films of all time, except Braveheart is not being allowed in our list.
Braveheart has a special place, a special show of its own, but we decided we'd stick to movies where I think at minimum it had to have guns in it. So Braveheart we took off that list.
Braveheart had a lot of axes and swords, a lot of hacking.
Yeah, so we'll have the hacking show for another time. So
top 5 hacking movies of all time.
That's right, with limbs getting hacked off. All right, so before we get into the reviews of our top 5s, first I have to acknowledge you guys because you're the ones who make this happen. I want to thank for everybody who's watching on YouTube, our YouTube audience. Thank you for watching. Hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, and the notification bell so you'll be notified anytime we come out with a new video. We'd appreciate it. And for those of you who are listening to our show on podcast, thank you as well. And we will, hopefully you'll continue to do so. We appreciate your support very much. All right, Mike.
Okay. So starting with my number 5, and just a little bit of backstory here. I know you, Norb, you told me you watched a couple movies before this, and I did watch one as well. And after I watched it, it actually went slightly down my list. I still wanted to keep it there because I think everyone should see this movie, but I moved something else further up. So it was kind of an interesting experience. I watched it just because I wanted Brett to see it, and but after watching it, I realized, this needs a place, but I got to move it down a little bit, and I can get more into that in a minute. Why?
Interesting.
So, and I also am going to ask your forgiveness because my number 5 is a tie. I had one movie, but I moved this down to go with it, and I'm calling number 5 my tribute to Vietnam films, and I picked 2. Now, before I reveal the big names, which you're probably already thinking, I know what those are. I pride myself on going back into the olden days, as Vanessa calls it, to appreciate films from all eras, because I don't want to be pigeonholed as just some review guy that is only going to review movies from 1980 and up. I don't think either of us want that kind of designation. But my picks all are from 1980 and up for this selection of choices. And there are a lot of movies, war movies from the 50s, 60s, and I'm just going to be honest, I haven't seen them. And maybe someday I'll get to them, but I haven't seen them. And because I haven't seen them, I can't pick them. And I don't have time to watch them all when we decide to do what we're going to do our show topic on 3 days before we do it. So in this essence, my list is going to be slightly more modern, and I hope you'll cut me some slack on that. So with that, my number 5 is a tie.
Hold on a second. Hold on. Before you get into it,
let
me get some, before we jump into the list.
I got you thinking.
Well, no. I'm not changing anything. I'm locked. I'm happy with my list. It's just very funny. You're coming in with right off the bat, begging for forgiveness and apologizing to the audience for your choices. And you're as a Watchman, you are entitled to whatever your opinion or whatever decade, whatever era you want to watch. You choose your movies from. That's totally your prerogative. On that note, I do have a movie that's not in the 80s and up category, which I'm happy to say, but I had to go out of my way to make sure that didn't happen because, it took some effort to get there. But I am, as always, interested whenever we do these top 5 lists to see what crossovers we may have, because I feel like there's a chance. I always feel like there's going to be at least 1, maybe 2 that will cross over, but seems like we're more surprised than we are expected when it comes to the results that we have. So it's just to see what you come up with. So with that, this was tough to decide. I agree that there were definitely some ones that I moved around, bounced them around, and I had to kind of reshuffle, but I feel good where it all landed.
Well, and as a movie reviewer, I think it's important that you have a good understanding of films from all decades and generations. How else are you going to call yourself someone who at least has some sense of cinema? And when it comes to war films are one of those genres that I just didn't watch a lot of them growing up, like the old stuff. You know, I think of things like Kelly's Heroes, you know, these movies, I know the titles, but I never saw them. I was more interested in action movies like Die Hard as a kid, stuff that had a lot of explosions and was cool. I didn't gravitate to those older war movies unless I happened to catch them on the 1 o'clock movie on KSDW channel 11 back in, you know, the day when we were, you know, in 8th grade. So again,
based on that, I would be guilty of more or less the same thing. I certainly haven't seen every war movie ever made, and I don't know if I'd ever get around to watching every single one. It would take some time to catch up. So we're not trying to be the experts on everything cinema, because if the only way you could be that is you'd have to have seen every single movie made out there to legitimize that you can actually compare every single one. But not enough time in the day. So we obviously have our slants. We have our childhood that comes from the 80s, and we have our preferences. So, you know, and I think you and I tend to align more of where we came from, since we are from similar generations, grew up, had similar childhoods, similar interests. So even that said, we still end up on very different results sometimes. So we do our best. But we are the watchmen, which means we come from the perspective from what we watch. And that doesn't always include everything. So we try to do our best, but hopefully you will appreciate the movies that we brought up. And I'm excited to find out what is on your list. So Mike, take it away with your number 5 tie.
And just to add to that, when you've got over 4 million subscribers to the Watchmen YouTube channel, I feel an obligation to just be specific on things, because there's a lot of people out there that are going to have opinions on what we have to say, Norb.
Yes, we don't want to disappoint the 4 million people out there who are watching our videos on a daily basis. Oh, wait, that's a few extra zeros. No, never mind.
One can dream. One can dream.
And you never know. Someday we'll look back at this and laugh. Remember when we joked that we had 4 million subscribers? Look at us now. We have 4.
I do think I have other people I listen to, and some people I know are very anti-top 5 ton, top 10 lists. They hate them. They hate them with a passion. And I can understand why. Sometimes it's hard to put things in a top 5 because there are so many great movies out there. We always talk about that. So sometimes I look at this as these are just 5 movies that you should see. And my number 1 is definitely the one, I guess if you're going to pick one, it's the one you should see first. And then maybe go down my list. So that's how I look at it. And with that, I will stop my rambling and get into this.
To your tie.
Again, yes. Thanks for the forgiveness on my tie. And this is my Vietnam number 5, which is a tie between Platoon from 1986 and Full Metal Jacket from 1987. 2 Vietnam War films that came out very close to each other and are both good in their own right. So I have a brief synopsis of each. Platoon, Chris Taylor leaves his university studies to enlist in combat duty in Vietnam in 1967. Once he's on the ground in the middle of battle, his idealism fades. Infighting in his unit between Staff Sergeant Barnes, who believes nearby villagers are harboring Viet Cong soldiers, and Sergeant Elias, who has more sympathetic view of the locals. So ends up pitting the soldiers against each other as well as against the enemy. This is directed by Oliver Stone, starring Charlie Sheen as Chris Taylor and Tom Berenger as Staff Sergeant Bob Barnes and William Dafoe as Sergeant Elias Rodin.
I think it's Elias.
Elias, thank you. Thank you.
Yes.
Norb, were either of these movies in your
They both
top
were.
5 list?
Actually, you're gonna knock 2 movies off my list right off the bat.
Okay, well then perfect. You take care of the synopsis on Full Metal Jacket. I'll save that for you. So I'll just talk a little bit about Platoon, and then you talk about what you want about, and then let's go to Full Metal Jacket. So
sounds good.
And that's why I had to ask for your forgiveness. I don't like to steal your thunder, but I felt like because these are both Vietnam-based films, they're both good movies, and they're both similar in a lot of ways, and they both came out practically at the same time. I feel like giving these a tie is maybe warranted here. So I don't know what you think, but you obviously put one above the other. So, and again, Platoon, the one thing I'll say about it is when Platoon came out, more than Full Metal Jacket, everybody was going to see it. I mean, even in The Naked Gun, during the musical montage, they made a funny joke about Leslie Nielsen and Priscilla Presley walking out of Platoon laughing
right.
while they're going through their dating montage.
Right.
But everybody was seeing Platoon. It was the movie to see, and I saw it too. I saw it at the John Dance Theater in Bellevue, Washington. And that was back in the fun days when the theaters in the Seattle area were huge. They had a balcony section. So when you saw a movie, you felt like you were seeing it with a big, big group of people. It was like going to a concert. It was really fun. But Platoon was an intense movie. I remember very intense. I'd never really seen a movie like that before. And it was brutal in its depiction of war. Obviously, a lot of feelings about the Vietnam War in itself. One thing I learned about the movie in my research is that this was quoted from William Dafoe. Upon arrival in the Philippines, the cast was sent on an intensive training course during which they had to dig foxholes and were subjected to forced marches and nighttime ambushes, which used special effects explosions. Led by a true Vietnam War veteran, Dale Dye, training put the principal actors, including Sheen, Dafoe, Depp, and Whitaker, through an immersive 30-day military-style training regimen. They limited how much food and water they could drink and eat. When the actors slept, they fired blanks to keep the tired actors awake. Dye also had a small role in the movie as Captain Harris, and Stone said he really wanted to break down these actors and mess with their heads so that they could get that real, authentic, dog-tired, don't give a damn attitude, irritation and anger, the casual approach to death. William Dafoe said the training was very important to the making of the film, adding to its authenticity and strengthening the camaraderie developed among the cast. He said, by the time you got through the training and through the film, you had a relationship to your gun. It wasn't going to kill people, but you felt comfortable with it. So what do you think about Platoon, Norb?
Well, again, this is a little weird to be hitting my number one. This was my number one movie.
Wow. Okay.
So, your tie on the bottom of the list is actually my number one, and Full Metal Jacket is my number. A little closer to where you're at. It's my number 4. Oh no, sorry, my number 5 movie. So actually, Full Metal Jacket is in the same spot that yours is. But I guess I would start by saying, since we'll talk about Full Metal Jacket in a second, I felt like these two movies are very different, actually. The only thing they have in common is that they take place, focus on the Vietnam War. But what I really liked about Platoon, I wouldn't say I liked it. I think what about Platoon was it was the first movie at that time that really disturbed me and exhausted me and made me feel like at the end I'd been through a war. I'd seen a lot of movies, not a lot of the old war movies, but I'd seen a lot of more of the sort of Rambos, and there was a lot of other depictions of war, but none of that had gotten to the real grit and level where you felt what it might be like to actually be in these guys' shoes, to feel that when you watch the Rambo movie and he's taking on guys in, communist rebels, all you see is just a bunch of guys running, he's mowing them down, and guys flying off of, just blowing up or flying out of there, they're very impersonal. And in this one, it really got to the level where not only was there's so much distrust amongst each other within the camp. You had the separation of Barnes, who was Tom Berenger playing the evil, dark side of things, and then Elias, who was kind of the cool, more chill guy, who the main character Charlie Sheen, who plays Chris Taylor. You have this nice bond with him, and he kind of takes him under his wing. But through so many scenes in there was just so many disturbing moments where I just felt uncomfortable the whole time, from the feeling inside the camp to when they first get sort of ambushed, or when one of the first, booby trap bombs go off and you see a guy with his arms blown off and he's just like, and he drops, and it was just really more disturbing than the typical just an explosion and a guy's dead. It just really made you feel like you were there. But really just as the movie progressed, they go into this Vietnamese village and they murder a woman at gunpoint, and then another guy There's this, I think, physically, mentally disabled boy who's there, and this one of the soldiers just takes a gun to his head, and it's just that whole feeling of this disconnect between right and wrong, and being there, everything just kind of got blurred. That people were doing things which none of these guys would have done in their normal lives, but because they've been subject to this machine.
Let me make a comment on that, Norb. Mm-hmm. Everything you've said, you could be describing Full Metal Jacket. Because I just watched Full Metal Jacket last night to refresh on that one. And I don't know the last time you saw Full Metal Jacket, but everything you said can be described as part of that movie.
Well, and again, I guess I'm trying not to jump the gun with Full Metal Jacket, but when it comes to Full Metal Jacket, there's the definitive part 1 and part 2. And to be honest with you, and most people, from just doing my little bit of online research, most people talk about what's most memorable about Full Metal Jacket is part 1. Part 2 is not. And
I watched part 2 last night. So everything, and I'll give you specifics, but everything you said about describing Platoon goes on in part 2 of Full Metal Jacket.
Well, and I'm not going to disagree that it didn't happen, but perhaps it's the timing because Platoon came first. But the impact that was done in Full Metal Jacket wasn't nearly as impactful as it was in Platoon. And obviously the entire movie Platoon spends the entire time in Vietnam, versus Full Metal Jacket spends at least the first half and maybe longer in just basic training. And so to me, they're like two different stories, because one focuses on the entire platoon and what they go through within the Vietnam battle, and the other one is, like I said, the two parts. So as a whole, again, Platoon being first, it was the first movie to do that. And the impact was so much stronger, probably because of the fact that it was the first one. Mm-hmm. And maybe that sort of deadens some of the impact that maybe if Full Metal Jacket came out first and flip-flop, maybe it would have been different, but it didn't. And I'm a big proponent of the argument that so many of these movies, really a lot of movies, but when it comes to these war movies, I do believe that there's a lot to be said about watching them at the time that they come out. And I'll get to this point again later when I talk about one of my other movies on the list. Most of the movies, with the exception of one, I saw them all when they came out. And they all had different impacts, but they usually resonated a very strong impact at the time of their release. So I'm not arguing that they didn't have it in there, but the impact from Full Metal Jacket was not nearly as close, and almost, to me, forgettable, maybe because it was just so overshadowed by the first part, which is so powerful from a basic training standpoint. But going back to Platoon, I think the part that really, as it continues to grow in the show, and you got the part where the ultimate betrayal happens, and Elias, and the famous scene where he's got his arm stretched out and he's getting shot, that's the part where Tom Berenger says that Elias is dead, and then we see that he's not dead, and in fact he's been left for dead, and it's too late to save him because he's getting shot up by the Viet Cong, and clearly at that point we realized that Tom Berenger, we knew that he'd shot Elias himself, but then
thank goodness for
Chris
slow-mo.
Taylor. Yeah, very dramatic. But Chris Taylor's the one who sees that, and he realizes, okay, Barnes is a bad guy, and really then it comes to that last sequence and that whole firefight at night that takes place when everything's just going to hell, and there's all kinds of killing going on, and air attack, and then you wake up the next morning, everything is sort of over, and you see this deer walking in the jungle, and there was that feeling of, because it just felt like such a tense buildup, and you just wanted it to be over because it was such an uncomfortable place to be. And so when it is finally over, it's just a big sigh of relief that we've survived this journey, and that Chris Taylor, our protagonist, survived, and he gets to go home, but he goes home a changed man because of what he's seen. So all those things, and again, it was the timing of it, the timing of how Oliver Stone, who, by the way, was a Vietnam vet and was the first one to be a Vietnam veteran who made a movie, directed a movie about it. That's, probably coming to the fact that it comes from his personal experience, had a lot to do with this movie being as powerful as it was. So there.
Okay. So got a lot to say.
There's a lot in there, but I think that was. I think from an impulse or your reaction standpoint, that's probably why that shot up to 1 for me.
I feel strongly of keeping them similarly, as a tie. I'm good with my tie, but that's fine. I have a few comments on Full Metal Jacket, but let's move on to Full Metal Jacket, and why don't you take the synopsis on that?
Okay, so Full Metal Jacket, as we touched on a little bit, I'll just give you a quick summary of that. So this is Stanley Kubrick's take on the Vietnam War. It follows smart aleck Private Davis, played by Matthew Modine, who quickly christened Joker by his foul-mouthed drill sergeant R. Lee Ermey. It says Ermey, right?
Lee
R. Lee Ermey.
R. Lee Ermey.
Yeah, so he's the drill sergeant who really became a household name after that movie. And pudgy Private Lawrence, played by Vincent D'Onofrio, nicknamed Gomer Pyle, as they endure the rigors of basic training. Though Pyle takes a frightening detour, Joker graduates to the Marine Corps and is sent to Vietnam as a journalist, covering and eventually participating in the bloody Battle of Hue. So, I did a lot of talking in the last one. I'm going to toss it back to you. You said you have some opinions about Full Metal Jacket.
Well,
so
let me ask you a question. All right, big question for you, Norb. And this is why I watched Full Metal Jacket last night. Because the scene with Gunnery Sergeant Hartman, the whole first part of the movie is basic training. And Gunnery Sergeant Hartman, played by Lee Ermey, he sucks you in no way that I can think any other war movie has done when it comes to basic training and what it means to have a drill sergeant that is going to make your life a living hell. And that is what makes the movie so memorable, is that first hour of the film where it's all basic training and there's no music. It's just constant chants, him yelling at him belittling them, making them feel like they are just worthless. And talk about just sucking you in with just the way this guy goes on. And he's got, I found myself thinking, I know guys like this really did exist in the military. How do they sleep? How do they come down from that screaming at people and just, have a beer with a friend? I've wondered that often. But I think about that when I think about Full Metal Jacket, but that's all I remember. I can't remember the second half, and that's why I watched it last night. So my question to you is, Norb, what else do you remember about Full Metal Jacket besides the drill sergeant part?
Well, what's funny is what I remember the most was the Vietnamese prostitute saying, "Me love you long time."
Of course, that's because they made it a song.
Make it a song, and it was one of those very unique moments of just iconic phrases that so not important, but it was very memorable.
What else?
Well, I did sort of shuffle through that movie, so I kind of refreshed my memory. I saw I did watch the sequence of things and how it played out at the end when Matthew Modine's character has to take out the assassin, and he fumbles at the moment of being able to take the shot, and she almost guns him down, and she gets shot up by one of his comrades, and then he becomes the one who has to pull the trigger and finish her off. So I saw some of those things, but my memory of it is still that, which was even at the time, I remember. I should say I remember. It was very forgettable what happened after the training part, because that part is so well done. And I know we're going to talk about what I don't remember from the second part, but I want to reiterate on the first part. So much of that first section on the basic training wasn't just what the drill sergeant, what his character was like, but it was the transformation of Gomer Pyle, Private Pyle, who had a little bit of a learning disability or something, but he struggled physically, he struggled mentally, he struggled, and at one point, because he was resulting in everybody else having to get more punishments from more runs and things like that because of his inability to do things. At one point in the film, they all beat him with, don't they wrap a soap or something inside a pillowcase?
They wrap a bar of soap inside towels and they all pummel him.
Matthew Modine holds him down while they all take a shot at him, and he's his friend. That's what I think the hardest part watching that was that his character.
Actually, it's not quite it. It's not quite it. It's another character that holds him down, and
that's right. He hits him. You're right. He hits him. He hits him at the end.
He's the last one to hit him, and he's very hestant about it.
You're right. I remember. Sorry, my detail's sketchy. I recall.
I watched this last night.
He walked up to him, and he was kind of like thinking twice, and then he takes the last slug and puts a pretty big wham on him. But I think that was probably one of the most powerful moments in that training section, just because you knew the guy couldn't help himself. It wasn't like he was trying to make it miserable for everybody, but everybody was so frustrated that they kept paying the price for all of his mistakes. And again, it was just that the guys taking matters into their own hands. But eventually that turning point drove him to become what looked like he was going to become the killing machine that the drill sergeant wanted. And instead it goes horribly, horribly wrong. And he ends up killing the drill sergeant and then turning the gun on himself. And that was just such a shocking moment. I think partially why it was hard to remember the second half is that I was so blown away, pardon the pun, I was so shell-shocked by how that sequence ended and how the first half ended that I was still recovering from that by the time we transitioned to the next stage, that it was hard to let that go and get into the next part of the act, which was very different because we no longer had the drill sergeant. We didn't have that storyline with this character that we'd spent all this first hour building up and had to change directions to something that was never as intense as that was. Not to say that it wasn't as good a job, but it was so intense and so well done in the first part that the second act just to me, second and third act, I guess, or more like the third act, just never quite raised the level that the first and second one had done so well. That's my justification for not remembering the second part. But since you see it fresh, you can continue to defend the second part.
Well, what I'm really defending is that I think these films can be treated on equal ground when it comes to how good they are. And I know you're putting Platoon higher because you're saying Platoon in general is more memorable. And I think they're both memorable, but just in different ways. But the messaging is the same. The entire second act of Full Metal Jacket takes place in Vietnam, and there are lots of moments where they talk about, why are we here? This is messed up. The Me Love You Long Time scene, you probably don't remember what happened right before that, but he's sitting with basically Joker's sitting with his photographer because he's sent to be a news, to do basically cover for news of the war. They're sitting there taking pictures, and this one Vietnamese person comes up and steals his camera and tosses it to another Vietnamese guy on a motorcycle. And they both mock him, like, we stole your camera, you guys are stupid, and they drive off. And the one guy says, these are the people we're trying to protect. And look at them, they're stealing from us. They're treating us like dirt. They think we're a joke. So one little moment of just, again, the messaging being the same is this is messed up that we're here. And then when they're actually going out to the front lines to see action, they're flying in a helicopter, and this gunner in the helicopter, he's mowing down innocent Vietnamese working in the rice paddies. He's just mowing them down, and they're running. And Joker says to him, "What? Do you kill women and children too?" He says, "Oh yeah." He says, "You just have to lead them a little less." I mean, that's awful. Right. And that's no different than Platoon. Platoon covers those same kinds of messages that soldiers, American soldiers, some of them were psychotically killing innocent people and using it as a reason to, they're given a gun, they're allowed to shoot it. And so they decide to shoot innocents because they can, and they won't get prosecuted for it. They won't get in trouble.
And I did actually watch that scene, and I'll just say this much: they're the same message, but there's a big difference between a guy cracking somebody's skull open at 2 feet away and a guy in a gunship firing from 200 yards away.
Well, did you see the part where he finally gets to the platoon and he says, "Hey, take my picture. Take my picture with my friend." And he's got this guy,
the dead guy.
Yeah,
Right.
the dead Vietnamese in the chair. So again, another moment where they're showing how they're inhumanely treating Vietnamese, no matter what side on. So what they're doing with them, posing for pictures with their dead bodies.
Yeah, I think the point is that pretty much all Vietnamese movies that are on this list and soon to be talked about, they pretty much all in some form carry that same message, which there's no film that ever glamorizes and says the Vietnam War was a good thing. I think they all show it as we shouldn't have been there. These are good people turning into evil, doing things that they never would do. Those themes are definitely consistent. And I think it was just Platoon took it to a higher level of discomfort for me. Those two scenes that you just described, I remember them. I did see those, but the other two that I could bring up are just more uncomfortable. They just more registered in my psyche because of the way they presented it.
And I agree with you, but because Act 1 of Full Metal Jacket, I don't think Platoon comes close to the first part, Full Metal Jacket, with the drill sergeant training. There's nothing like that in Platoon, which is, again, why I put the movies on such similar levels. They both have their strengths and weaknesses, as you call it. And so, again, I'm going to stick with that. I feel like they truly are even on a level of worth watching.
Okay.
But
I'm just glad they're on the 5 because they do belong on the 5. I'm glad you didn't knock it down from the top 5.
Yeah. And now I've learned I've never tried to watch a movie by scanning it. So it's something I haven't tried.
Well, when there isn't time to watch everything, it's better to at least see some things so that they can jar my memory. Because, like a lot of times these movies we've seen before, we kind of know them, but it's just been so long and it just need a little refresher. So I might need to just go through and go, oh, yeah, there's that, right. There's that sequence. And then, you can't, it's not the same as watching it entirely again. But you can, as I like to famously quote, get the gist when you scan through things. I'm the gist master. So I'm really good at getting the gist of things.
All right. Well, let's move on to your number 5.
Well, actually, it'd be my number 4 because Full Metal Jacket was my number 5.
Oh, I'm sorry. You're right. All right. So should I do number 4 or then is it your number 4?
I think I did. I read the synopsis for 5 for Full Metal Jacket. So you should do your 4.
All right. I don't expect this one to be in your list. So my number 4 goes back to 1805. Now the movie wasn't made in 1805. It takes place in 1805. And it is called Master and Commander, The Far Side of the World.
Not on my list.
And have you ever seen it?
Nope.
Okay. This is from 2003. So in 1805, aboard the HMS Surprise, the brash Captain Jack Aubrey, played by Russell Crowe, and his trusted friend, the ship's scholarly surgeon, Stephen Maturin, played by Paul Bettany, are ordered to hunt down and capture a powerful French vessel off the South American coast. Though Napoleon is winning the war and the men and their crew face an onslaught of obstacles, including their own internal battles, Lucky Jack is determined that nothing will stop the Surprise from completing its mission. This was directed by Peter Weir, again starring Russell Crowe and Paul Bettany. I'm sad you haven't seen this movie, Norb. And you know what was interesting to me is I found out late at the end of the year that our friend Rob had never seen this movie either. It was one of those that he was boycotting at the time. I think it was near Cutthroat Island or something else. And I don't think that's right, but there was some reason he told me that he didn't want to see it. So I went over to his place and we watched it. And at the end he said, "Wow, that was really good." I didn't realize how good that was. I just didn't think it was going to be any good. But I'm sorry you've missed this one. It's a great film. The movie is so much about. It really is about the friendship between Captain Aubrey and the Doctor Stephen, and how they are really at odds through this entire war. Jack Aubrey is all about capturing the French ship and bringing it back as a victorious statement of them winning the war. Dr. Stephen his job is to fix anybody who gets hurt in battle, but he loves the study of animals. And this was back at the time where there were still new lands to be discovered and new animal species to find and learn about. So he was all about whenever they would have to stop and resupply on an island, he would go exploring and find all the interesting creatures. And he had books and he would catalog them. So their friendship was based on a mutual respect for one another, but they were at perfect odds at why they were both out there. And of course, Jack could always, when they'd have an argument, Jack could always come back and say, we're at war. This is a vessel of war. I know you like your little creatures and bugs and insects, but when it comes down to it, our job is to capture that ship, and that's what we're going to do. So this movie is about their relationship, and what's great is finally there's things happen, and maybe I'll leave this relatively spoiler-free just in case you want to see this, but decisions are made that it ends up where they both help each other out, and they both end up kind of getting what they want, but it's done in a way you wouldn't expect. And that's one thing that made this movie so wonderful. And I know you can't say anything about this movie, Norb, so I will add that there's one little story that is one of the best, and it symbolizes to me what it means to look at someone with awe and reverence, especially someone you've never met. So they're sitting around dinner, and they're asking Captain Aubrey to talk about this other famous captain that was well known amongst the forces as the captain of the day. And of course, Jack Aubrey served under this captain a long time ago. And so they're all sitting around dinner, and he says, what can you tell me about him? And so Russell Crowe's character sits back and he says, well, he said, he spoke to me twice. And on one occasion, I can remember he leaned over at me and he said in a very deep voice, could I trouble you for the salt? So the point is, all he said to him is, could you pass the salt? and the point is that's really it. There was no words of wisdom that he passed down. It was just, he said, could you pass the salt? And that to me was a message that can be looked at in our modern day times. If sometimes, you know, we may look up to a famous person like Harrison Ford or Steven Spielberg, but you know what? Harrison Ford takes a crap on the toilet just like we do. He's just a person, just like us, even though we can put him up high on a pedestal.
But it's an Indiana Jones or a Han Solo crap, so it's something more special.
So, and with that,
buy it from eBay and pay some money for it.
So I don't know if you have any thoughts on my,
well, I have a question, because I know nothing about this movie. I remember it when it came out, and I think I remember you telling me about it and saying I should see it, but I never did. Is this the movie where somebody says, to our wives and to our girlfriends, may they never meet? Is this that movie?
Yes, that is the one.
Okay, yeah. I think you told me about that line, so somehow I remember that, of all the things, but I don't know much past that. So I do have a pretty good memory on some things.
That's good. He says yes to wives and sweethearts, may they never meet.
Yeah, so I remember that. I do remember weird, strange details from various conversations. That was one of them. That's all I knew about Master and Commander, that Russell Crowe was in it and that line. So I'll put it on my to watch list sometime. And
well, I know you like Russell Crowe. You know, Russell Crowe is a great actor, and Paul Bettany is a great actor, and they have a wonderful chemistry between them. And I haven't touched on the action, but there's some really good naval battles in this movie where they, you know, it's all done with cannons, musket guns, and a lot of hacking. You know, once you board the ship, but the action is really good. So I'll just leave it at that. But I highly recommend.
And I see Peter Weir was the director of it, which I liked a lot of his movies that he's directed.
Dead Poets Society.
So, and I think he directed Witness, if I'm not mistaken, too. So,
yep.
I never avoided this movie like I didn't want to see it. It's just, you know, sometimes a movie comes, and like we said earlier, sometimes it just goes by and we don't see it. And this was one of those. It was one of those.
Well, and Rob was right there with you. He never saw it either.
Well, he said he boycotted it, so he had more of a reason. I didn't boycott this. I just didn't get around to it.
Yeah.
Rob has a history of boycotting things at certain times when he feels strongly. I remember he boycotted McDonald's for a while because Married with Children the McDonald's pulled out as a sponsor from them because they thought the show was too edgy or inappropriate. So Rob was boycotting McDonald's because he didn't like the fact that they pulled out of Married with Children. God knows.
I had not heard that.
Yep. In fact, we were on one of our road trips, and Rob did not want to eat at McDonald's, even though that was the most convenient place to go most of the time because of his boycott.
Well, he really drew a line in the sand there, didn't he?
He tried to. Sometimes, though, that line would get crossed. And he
well, the ocean definitely does wash away those lines in the sand at some point.
Yes. And that line got washed, apparently, because you and Rob got to watch it. So I have no line to wash, but I may get around to it. I can guarantee you this. I will see this before I watch Star Trek Deep Space Nine. So that will certainly happen before that point. Okay, so I guess that brings me to my number 4. And I was mentioning about how we were talking about Vietnam movies, and I'm going to bring another one here. And this would be Apocalypse Now. And let me describe it first. So this takes place in Vietnam in 1970. Captain Willard, played by Martin Sheen, takes a perilous and increasingly hallucinatory journey upriver to find and terminate Colonel Kurtz, played by Marlon Brando, a once promising officer who is reportedly gone completely mad. In the company of a Navy patrol boat filled with street-smart kids, a surfing-obsessed air cavalry officer played by Robert Duvall, and a crazed freelance photographer played by Dennis Hopper, Willard travels further and further into the heart of darkness. Directed and produced and co-written by Francis Ford Coppola, this movie won 8 Academy Award, or was nominated for 8 Academy Awards, and including Best Picture. So, have you seen this, Mike?
Well, we've discussed this in the past. I have not seen this, and it's one I want us to do an entire show dedicated to, because I have the disc. I want to watch it. I know I need to see it, and that's why I can't put it in my top 5. And maybe it might be after I've seen it, but it's one I missed. I did not draw a line in the sand on this movie. There was no boycotting. I just never saw it.
So now I'm at odds with myself here how much to talk about this movie, because I knew you hadn't seen it. I saw it really in research for this because I felt compelled I needed to watch this movie. The more guilty I kept thinking when I was watching Vietnam movies, I felt like I needed to watch this. So I did.
Well, I think you need to keep this spoiler free because there is an audience out there, people besides me, that have not seen this. So,
Okay, I think I can do that. I think I can do that. And there's some certain things that are out there that aren't secretive, but
I know there's nothing like the smell of napalm in the morning. I know that. So like you, I've heard a couple things.
Right. Well, and I was like you. I knew a couple of moments, some things that's hard to escape. That famous scene that Robert Duvall makes that line. I knew about the famous scene where the helicopters come flying in with the music from Ride of the Valkyries playing, dun 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 dun, and they start lighting up the village and the vegetation all around that area. This movie, I guess I could focus on just the background of it. It's a fascinating story that this movie even got made. This movie had problems throughout the process. It was, as I said, it was directed by Francis Ford Coppola, and there's legendary stories about things that went wrong. I think the most famous one is how, in directing Martin Sheen in one of the opening scenes of the movie, he actually suffered a heart attack during the shoot. And there's a famous story about how while he was having this heart attack, it didn't happen during the scene, but it happened on a separate day. But as he was having this heart attack, he actually had to crawl from the hotel because nobody was with him, crawled out of the hotel and got picked up by a public bus to get taken to the hospital. But there was that scene that he just drove, Coppola really had him drunk. He had him locked in this room for a long time to get just the right performance out of him. And it just is one of the many stories that went into this movie becoming as legendary as it is. The other flip side to it, and I talked about this in our previous review about Superman, how Marlon Brando came in where he had all these stipulations, wanted a lot of money. He didn't prepare. Well, it sounds like this is kind of his MO back in the late 70s, because it was the same thing. He showed up for this production and he came in overweight. He didn't prepare for his role. He was trying to work the minimum amount of time. So they had to drastically alter the way they shot him because his physical appearance wasn't what they had created for him in the movie. So they had to resort to shooting in shadows, putting him in black, and just kind of altering the production photography style to make up for the fact that this guy came in just obese. And so it's wild to think that while you've got Martin Sheen on the one hand suffering for days on end to pull this movie together, you have Marlon Brando on the other side, who clearly he's got the cachet and the name to just kind of call his own shots, but forcing the production team to have to work around him. So these were just a few of the things that were problems with this film. The movie was shot in the Philippines, as was Platoon, mostly because much of the vegetation, the people, and the fact that the United States air bases were there. They had a lot of military support to make the production a little bit easier than trying to actually shoot in Vietnam. But I will say with this film, this is one where even as I'm watching it, having watched it now and watching it, wishing I had seen it when it came out. Of course, I couldn't have because I was only a very young kid. I had opportunities to watch it later. I just never got around to it like yourself. But I feel like had I watched this then, the impact that I've had to wait till Platoon to come out, this movie could have done the same thing. It has that same level of disturbing nature, the brutality of war, the madness of war, as Marlon Brando says so famously at the end. It talks about the horror of war. There's a lot of
madness. The end of Bridge on the River Kwai.
Yeah. And so I'm trying to be careful here because I don't want to spoil this for you. But do you know about the famous water buffalo?
Yeah, maybe. It doesn't ring a bell.
Oh, well, if it's a maybe, then you don't know. So, well, there's a lot of water buffalo in the Philippines. In fact, I rode one time, so I'm not going to talk about it because it's too important of a part to the show.
Well, I want us to do a show on this one.
Okay. Well, we will, and we'll get much more in depth on it. But I guess I'll just finish by saying that this movie, as I watched it, and especially the appreciation for when it took place and the challenges he had to overcome. They had weather problems that practically destroyed their half of their sets because they had a typhoon in the Philippines that was very destructive. They had 238 days of shooting.
Wow.
238 days. That's
approaching
crazy.
a year.
And he had to edit over 1 million feet of film. So, I mean, the amount of material with multiple cameras and the large sets and the number of extras they had, it really made me appreciate what they accomplished and the fact that they got it done. So, and it is definitely something you must watch if you haven't seen it.
Now, have you seen the famous documentary his daughter made called Heart of Darkness? Have you seen that?
I have not yet. And that's
that
something
is
we'll probably have to watch
famous in itself.
Yeah, because it talks about all those problems behind the scenes of it. So, but I know I'd heard about some of the stories, but we might have to do a 1-2 punch watching that and the documentary.
Well, I have the disc, and the disc has the documentary on it.
Well,
so
there we go.
We'll share that, and I think
we'll go more in depth and have more detailed reviews from both sides, from both of us on that one. But definitely for me, it's number 4. It would probably have been higher if I'd watched it at the time it came out. I couldn't have, but if I'd watched it at a little earlier point, prior to the other movies I talked about, this might have been higher on the list. It's very powerful, even 40 years later. It's pretty amazing.
All right.
So you get to go to your number 3, right?
Well, I know, yeah, it's funny how you talked about this movie being 40 years old. My number 3 is 1 year old. So it's just getting started, but my number 3 is a film called Midway, which I know you have seen.
Mm-hmm.
On December 7th, 1941, Japanese forces launch a devastating attack on Pearl Harbor, the U.S. naval base in Hawaii. But that's not what this movie's about. 6 months later, after Pearl Harbor, the Battle of Midway Island commences on June 4th, 1942, as the Japanese Navy once again plans a strike against American ships in the Pacific. For the next 3 days, the U.S. Navy and a squad of brave fighter pilots engaged the enemy in one of the most important and decisive battles of World War II. This is directed by Noah Emmerich, stars Ed Skrein as Lieutenant Richard Dick Best, Patrick Wilson as Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, and Woody Harrelson as Admiral Chester W. Nimitz. So I didn't have a lot of expectations for this film. I was fortunate and lucky to see it in the Dolby Cinema, and boy, it had a great wallop on the sound of the battle scenes. What I like about this movie so much is everyone knows about Pearl Harbor. Everyone. But I never knew about the Battle of Midway. So this movie to me was a 2-hour entertaining historical account of a part of World War II that I knew nothing about and had no idea how important it was, as well as the code breaking involved that the Americans had to do to learn about the Japanese planned attack on Midway before it happened. I love the scenario where the codebreaker tries to explain to Nimitz why he can't pinpoint, because the people running the war, they want to know when it's going to happen, what time and what day, but the codebreakers can't give him that. And so what he said, think of it as like a wedding. He said, you know that the caterers have been booked. You've got an idea that it's around this time, and they're booking the caterers, the photographer, and so you know when it's going to happen, but you just don't know exactly the perfect point in time. And I really like that analogy of why code breaking is tricky, because you just get bits and pieces of information and you try to piece it together. So this movie was a passion project for director Noah Emmerich. He had a lot of trouble getting financial support for the film, and the Chinese government, well, I should say the government, but the Chinese investors kicked in to help get this movie made, which it did have a little part in it, showing how the Chinese were also getting attacked by the Japanese. But I really liked, the last thing I'll say is that the story told this account of what happened from both sides, not just the Americans, from the Japanese. They had some really, really good prominent Japanese actors play the parts of the Japanese side. And I enjoyed that because you really get a sense of how they're both trying to figure out what to do to win. And it's a reminder to me that many Japanese people who were fighting, they were just following orders. You know, they weren't necessarily against America. They just were, doing what they were supposed to do. So much of following orders back then, and Japan was a dictatorship. So if you didn't do what you were told, you'd probably get shot. So that's my thoughts on Midway.
So yeah, I saw Midway as well. What I remember, what I really liked about that movie was the depiction of the aerial dogfights, particularly the parts where they're dive bombing the ships. I remember I'd seen a lot of World War II footage of cameras in planes showing the perspective of either shooting down enemy aircraft or dive bombing into a ship while you see all the bullets flying at them and they're firing things at them and trying to take them down or drop a bomb on them. And they did a pretty good job, I remember, of creating that feeling of what it'd be like to be in one of those planes heading right to the mouth of the lion, right? And I remember that feeling of, we have certain pilots who survived, and obviously a lot of them who got killed during those battles. But sometimes I thought, man, it's just sheer luck that these guys survived, because you have so much military fire all flying around. This guy to the left gets killed, this guy to the right gets killed, and this guy just happens to not get killed because by luck the shell didn't hit his plane. And I thought that must have been how it was like. I'm sure that they're obviously the better skilled pilots who could do better, but a lot of times I'm guessing that it must have just been pure luck that you didn't get killed, because there's so much chaos, so many fragments flying around you. And if you didn't get hit by one, it was just kind of a miracle. And I remember that being probably the most immersive part of watching this film was those parts where you're just kind of like tensely hanging on, like going down a roller coaster, and this long path into there. I was like you too. The story of the strategic importance of Midway, I wasn't that strongly familiar as to what was at stake and what had followed the Pearl Harbor bombing. So I too found that very, educational and interesting, and trying to understand what was going to happen, because I never really knew the chess match that happened after all that. So that was really cool.
It was a real learning experience of how those ships on those, how the aircraft carriers, how all that worked, and the planes had those very tight little runways to land, and how you run out of fuel, you have to think about fuel, all the things that I think nowadays is different. But back then there were so many things. So it was, again, so much education for me on how that all worked.
Yeah. So I think the only reason I didn't put on my list was there was just other movies that I was more affected by. This one was good, and I had some great moments. It just didn't move me as much as the other ones on my list. But it's not a bad movie. It is definitely good and has its moments. Just there are a few others I think deserve to be on the list. So,
all right.
So that takes me into my number 3, and that would be the movie Schindler's List.
I figured this would be in your top.
For those of you who haven't seen this, for very few of you who haven't seen this, this is the story about businessman Oskar Schindler, played by Liam Neeson, who arrives in Krakow in 1939, ready to make his fortune from World War II, which has just begun. After joining the Nazi Party primarily for political expediency, he staffs his factory with Jewish workers for similarly pragmatic reasons. When the SS begins exterminating Jews in the Krakow ghetto, Schindler arranges to have his workers protected to keep his factory in operation, but soon realizes that in so doing, he is also saving innocent lives. This movie stars also Ben Kingsley, plays Itzhak Stern, and Ray Fine as Amon Goth, the brutal German officer who runs the camp. This was directed by Steven Spielberg, nominated for 12 Academy Awards and won 7, and it became the first Oscar that Spielberg won as director. It was also winner of Best Picture, and it got Best Cinematography as well. And shot entirely in black and white. And this was a movie that I think, we had all been rooting for Steven Spielberg to win an Oscar. And he was denied so many times. I think he should have won one for Raiders. I can't believe that Chariots of Fire beat Raiders of the Lost Ark. Are you freaking kidding me? But anyway, so we had to wait till Schindler's List came out. And then the story is kind of interesting behind how he took this on, because the story had been floating around for a while. And originally Spielberg didn't want to do it. He felt like he might not be mature enough to tell this story, and tried to pass it off to other directors, including let's see, I forgot which ones he sent to, but he had actually given it to Martin Scorsese, and he had this realization that
Martin Scorsese?
Martin Scorsese.
Oh yeah, Martin Scorsese.
And instead he had a realization that he needed to do this. And so while he was on the set of Hook, he decided, no, I need to take this movie. So he talked to Martin and told him, hey, you know what? I'd like to get my movie back, but in exchange, I'll give you the remake of Cape Fear with Robert De Niro, which turned out to be its own pretty powerful movie. So he took it back and decided to do it himself. And this became obviously a very personal project of his. He took no salary. He didn't get paid a dime for it. And in fact, even forfeited his profits to be made from the movie to be donated to the USC Shoah Foundation, which was established in 1994 to honor and remember the survivors of the Holocaust. So this was a very obviously personal project for Steven Spielberg, and I think it comes across in the storytelling. He decided he was going to take a very documentary style, which is why he went black and white, because most World War II film footage is in black and white. And he and the director of photography, Janusz Kaminski, they decided they would use no storyboards, no Steadicams, no crane shots, or zoom lenses. Everything was like 40% was handheld. Really wanted to get that documentary feel. And yeah, this movie was very disturbing. I knew quite a bit from school and about the Holocaust, but I think this is the first time it really puts you in there with the the journey, the terrible journey that they went through from going from being wealthy business owners to being put to the ghetto and then taken from the ghetto to this camp and being killed often randomly. And the true story of Oskar Schindler and how he went from greedy business person to a guy who realized he could save their lives and gave up his fortune to do so. It was a really emotional story. And I think really at the end when he has that speech when he's talking about how this pen could have saved 2 people and this car, I could have bought 10 people, and he breaks down crying, was, there was definitely the teary-eyed moment of the show. And when he realizes how much he'd wasted so much money, could have saved so many more people. But such a powerful film. I'm sure everybody has seen this, but I love this movie. Again, I saw it when it came out in the theater, and it didn't disappoint. So, Mike, what are your memories on?
I like this movie.
Schindler's
It's
List?
not on my list. I haven't seen it lately, but I saw it when it came out, and it was a great homage and respect to the people that struggled in the Holocaust. But it's just not on my list. But
Well, and
I can't say anything bad about it.
it's I think normally, even for myself, it wasn't until I realized it was considered a war movie that
It
wouldn't have put it on there first, because normally you think of a war movie where there's lots of army soldiers with guns, and this movie didn't focus on that. There was very little about the actual battle, but I still think it still falls under the qualification. So
Sure.
that's the number 3 on my list.
I remember in my behind-the-scenes study of Schindler's List, it talked about how they would not film inside the Auschwitz camp.
Right.
They filmed when they filmed the train coming into the camp, they actually filmed it outside the gate. So it's like they did a flop. It just made the outside look like the inside. So that was the way they had. The entry was correct, but they did not. And I know that was done for many reasons, just out of respect for all the people that had to be there. So, yeah.
Yep.
All right. My number 2 is also a movie that's not very old, and we did a show on this movie. It's called 1917. I could not put 1917 in my top 5 because how much I love this movie. How much did I love this movie? Well, watch the other show where we did an entire
whole show on it.
review on it. I'm going to really not go on about this movie too much. I'll read the synopsis. During World War I, 2 British soldiers, Lance Corporal Schofield and Lance Corporal Blake, receive seemingly impossible orders. In a race against time, they must cross over into enemy territory to deliver a message that could potentially save 1,600 of their fellow comrades, including Blake's own brother. Directed by Sam Mendes, starring George McKay as Lance Corporal William Will Schofield and Dean Charles Chapman as Lance Corporal Thomas Tom Blake. This movie, if you don't know, was all done in one shot. And that's what makes this war movie so unique and so important to take a look at, because to me, when it's one shot, it's like you're there. And the horrors of war really come through in this film of what it'd be like to be walking through places with booby traps, dead bodies, dealing with still the constant fighting that's going on. So I love this movie. I find it interesting. I think there's a group of people out there that actually really hate this movie for the same reason I like. You know, it's those line in the sand type folks we know. I think there's a group out there that they just like to not like something if everyone else likes it, because this movie was really well liked. So I find that humorous, because what's not to like about this film? And you have to appreciate the one-shot aspect of it, which not just from a technical standpoint, but from the fact that it's like looking through a window. It's a 2-hour looking through a window, like you're there with these people going through what they're going through, and you can really focus on things like you would in real life. Real life, when we look at things through our eyes, it is one shot.
I think one of our friends, though, didn't like that approach, right? I think it was actually the one-shot approach and the way the camera has to function in a one-shot type of technique that he didn't appreciate.
He also didn't see it in a theater either. He watched it while he was multitasking on 5 other things. So, sorry. I'm going to discredit that opinion because I know how you watch movies.
Well, that's just what I'd heard. That was the one person that who'd seen it who didn't like it, which was in the minority for sure. Yeah,
I mean,
like
Norm,
you said,
imagine trying to watch this movie skimming past it, or imagine trying to watch 1917 while you're multitasking, checking your email,
No, this is
responding to texts. A family member comes in the middle of the movie and asks you for something. Imagine trying to watch 1917.
Well, and I'm as guilty as anybody else of certain shows I'll multitask, but I'm selective on how I multitask. There's certain shows you can multitask and certain shows you can't. You can't, for one, never try to multitask a show in a foreign language that has subtitles because you can't. You can't understand the dialogue. That's rule number one. Rule number two, if it's going to be a one-take show, you can't multitask because the moment you take your eyes off the screen, you're ruining the beauty of a one-take wonder that is the challenge of creating the simulation of a movie that was shot in one take. So this definitely falls under that category.
Well, and we use the term big cinema, big cinema. That really means something you need to see in the theater. And this is that kind of a movie.
Yeah, well, at least, and if you are going to watch it at home on a hopefully big TV with a good sound system, you got to at least not be trying to fold laundry and do your bills at the same time. That definitely is going to ruin the experience. Yeah. But I love this movie as well. And to be honest, I have to confess that this movie bounced around a lot like a pinball. This was the one that kept on. I think it was between that whole thing you brought up in the beginning where I was feeling somewhat guilty that I'm putting too many new movies in the show and I needed to be a little more respectful of the older films. And so 1917 was solidly in there and it got bounced for a couple of different reasons and eventually bounced off completely. So it's not in my, but it did hover there for a while. And, unfortunately, it got bounced off, but it did.
You probably thought, I already talked about this one. I'm going to talk about something new.
Yeah, maybe that too. But it came down to it for a tiebreaker. We did a show on 1917. We don't need to take up space on my list. But it's definitely good. Unfortunately, just couldn't land a spot in the top 5, which is always hard to do.
Well, I feel like no other war movie has tried to be one shot.
That's
why
for
1917 to me, even though it's not old, it deserves a spot in the top.
Definitely. Well, I guess that puts me now to, since we already talked about my number 1, all I've got left is number 2, which will be interesting to see if this one, I think this will be on your list, but we will find out. You only have one movie left to correct.
I have one left.
So I wonder if this is going to be the same one. We'll find out. But my number 2, again, this is number 2, not number 1, but it's the last on my list because we already talked about my number 1, Platoon. So number 2 for me is, no wait, I know this is not your number 1 because I think I know what your number 1 is. But number 2 for me is Saving Private Ryan. Nope, right? It's not, is it?
Nope.
I didn't think so. I know what yours is. Okay. So number 2 is Saving Private Ryan. And in this movie, Captain John Miller, played by Tom Hanks, takes his men behind enemy lines to find Private James Ryan, played by Matt Damon, whose 3 brothers have been killed in combat. Surrounded by the brutal realities of war while searching for Ryan, each man embarks upon a personal journey and discovers their own strength to triumph over an uncertain future with honor, decency, and courage. Again, this is directed by Steven Spielberg, was nominated for 11 Academy Awards and won 5, including Best Director, Best Cinematography, and Best Picture. The same cinematographer who did Schindler's List teamed up with Steven Spielberg to do this, Janusz Kaminski. And this movie, why is this number 2 for me? Again, even as I'm putting this list together and talking about it, what I realized for myself and what's separating certain movies from others is I have to be deeply affected for a movie to be a war movie to be on this list. Because there's a lot of movies about war. There's a lot of movies that have themes about war, but there's only certain ones that will put it on my list. And for me, that has to have a resonating long-term effect where in some way or form, I always go back to that when I think about things that disturbed me. I remember, that's like that scene from this movie, or that reminds me of this moment from this movie. And I think every one of these movies has one of those moments on there. And so if it didn't do that to me, that's why it didn't end up on the list. Not because it wasn't well written, well shot, or didn't have a good theme into it. It was just, it has to, for me personally, disturb me. There's got to be a disturb level on there. And this had a few of those in this movie. And I'd seen a lot, obviously. Had seen Platoon already and Full Metal Jacket and several others before Private Ryan. But there were just certain things in this movie that moments that were really hard to watch. In particular, there was one scene where there was a medic. His name was Wade, Medic Wade, and it's about midway through the movie. But this guy, he is the medic, and he gets shot. And rarely do you see a movie where the medic gets shot. Usually the medic's patching everybody up, right? But in this case, he's the medic, and they're trying to patch him up, and he's trying to tell everybody what to do and how it looks, and so they're all huddled around him, and he's got bullet holes in his stomach and blood's oozing out of it, and he goes from trying to be diagnostic to eventually he's fading. They just keep pumping him up full of morphine, and at the very end, he turns into a whimpering kid asking for his mommy, and he just fades off. And that scene still now is hard for me to watch because it's so well directed in a disturbing kind of way that it's hard for me. I can't forget that scene. So that's one of them. And then probably the other one that really sticks with me is there's another scene at the end where one of the prisoners who they let go, I think it was at that battle, they let this one German soldier go. He comes back and he ends up getting into a knife fight with one of the other soldiers in Tom Hanks, in Captain John Miller's group. And they have this extended knife fight. And at the end of it, the German guy gets the knife and he's on top of it, and they're like pushing the knife off. And most action movies, whenever you get to that point, the knife is here. All of a sudden, the hero gets the extra strength to fight it off, and then eventually he gets the win. Well, in this case, he doesn't. The knife starts to come in, and it starts to get right to his clothes, and he starts to, and you can just feel him like he knows what's about to happen, but he's not stopping. And the blade starts to penetrate the clothes, goes into his chest, and sinks in, and he's staring right at his killer's face as it's happening. And I felt like I was right there. I felt like I could feel the knife going into my heart watching that. And that's the scene that's definitely stuck with me forever since I've seen that movie. And those two scenes alone, there's more, but those two definitely hit me on the memorable Norb got disturbed factor. And there's a big reason why that movie ended up on this list. So Mike, I know you've seen it too. So curious what your thoughts are.
Well, I'm biting my tongue here. I can't wait to speak because I've got a couple things to ask you about, Norb. So you and I saw this together. We saw this at the Crossroads Cinema in Bellevue, and I remember two very distinct things, but they were actually reasons you didn't like it very much.
Oh, and I have them. I think I know what they are. But go ahead, and I'll see if I know what they are.
So. The first part is we both agreed on this one. This was where Spielberg was trying to use a high shutter on the action, and so it's a natural action shot with a film camera. When the shutter is running its normal 1/80th, there's an inherent blur that we get used to in motion. That it helps kind of just smooth out motion when you have a 24 frames per second rate for the film. But if you tune up the shutter and make it move much faster, all the motion blur is gone and every still frame is sharp. So you get this weird effect. And nowadays we see it a lot, and I think it's done more. At that time it was different, and I remember both of us were like, it's distracting. I remember it was distracting during the whole D-Day invasion at the beginning of the movie. I felt like it took me out of the movie because it was almost like when you saw The Hobbit and they did it at 48 frames per second, it was too smooth at times. It was distracting. And at the time that high shutter was distracting. So that was the one thing I remember. Both of us walked out, we're like, I wish that had been done normally. But the big part, Norb, I remember you went.
So don't go to. I'm going to.
I know, but I get to tell this.
Oh, no, that's fine. But I want to address the first point. So,
fine.
But I've come around because it was distracting because one, as filmmakers and who we're familiar with always trying to get the film look, when we saw that high shutter, choppy stroboscopic looking imagery, it was distracting because we'd never seen it before.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is that now that I've come around and we look at this now 20 something years when this first was introduced. It's interesting now because really they were taking a chance on a technique that they knew was going to be edgy and not familiar. But ever since then, they sort of revolutionized the action movie photography style, because after that, everybody, and still today, continue to use that. Not just action movies, horror movies, anything you want to have ramped up sort of visceral action, you do the Saving Private Ryan look, which is you crank up that shutter speed and make everything real choppy and stroboscopic. And so I have to give them credit now, even though at the time I didn't like it because I wasn't familiar. And now that I have since embraced it, we've utilized it in our own techniques, and it's become a part of the modern day landscape of cinematography. I actually give them credit now for blazing a trail and doing something so radically different that its impact wouldn't be seen for years and years to come. So my short-sightedness of just not liking how it was at the beginning, over time I have grown to appreciate it, utilize it, and it is pretty cool how Spielberg and Kaminsky came up with that plan.
You know what's funny is I think, though, Norb, you and I both draw the line at these filmmakers like Ang Lee trying to do movies at 60 frames a second.
That's a whole different thing.
I will never get used to that. You're talking about we got used to the high shutter speed effect. That was distracting when we first saw Saving Private Ryan. We both talked about it. But now, like you said, so many people done it. We've gotten used to it. But boy, 60 frames per second, I am not going to get used to that. 24 is the way it's got to stay.
I agree. And I always wonder, and to me, they're two totally different things. That one you can get used to us, we can't get used to the other. And what we're talking about when we say 60 frames per second, for those of you who may not be understanding what we're talking about, it's the smooth motion you see watching a soap opera or live TV show, like a news show, versus when you watch cinema at 24 frames per second, there's a certain strobe that is what is that film look. And there's been pushed by some filmmakers to shoot at that higher speed where everything looks really smooth, but it just doesn't look like you're watching a movie, at least to us. And we always wonder, someday, will a generation of people, the younger generation, come to a point where they love that look and say goodbye to 24 frames per second? It hasn't happened yet. They've tried to start it and it just has not caught on. So I don't know, maybe 24 frames per second will stay forever, but they've tried to do it and it just has not stuck. Thank goodness, because I don't like it. They have TVs that, most of the TVs you buy now automatically create that smooth look. And you have to go way out of your way to turn it off. But most people don't know how to do it. And it drives me nuts when people leave their TV in that smooth motion mode. It drives me absolutely crazy. I just need to pick up the remote and say, stop everything. Let me fix this for you. You're being lied to. This is wrong.
It's a fascinating psychological thing because video games are best played at 60 frames a second.
Yeah, absolutely.
But movies, it's complete opposite. Why you want to watch them at 24?
And I think the difference is it's a game and you need information to track to play. But in a movie, you're not playing, you're watching. And I think that's the biggest difference. In a game, you want every advantage so that you can have as much smoothness and detail so that you can lock on to whatever you're focused on. Versus a movie, you want an experience. So hopefully the generations to come will hold on to that belief, because I certainly don't want 24 frames per second to go away anytime soon. So
the other part of Saving Private Ryan is the end. Matt Damon's character morphs into this old man, and he says something I remember. I remember more than that part. I remember you going off when we came out of the movie, going, that was supposed to make me feel something and cry. That was terribly immersive. And he says, tell me I did okay. Tell me I did okay. You were like mocking this old man voice, and you were so irritated about that ending, which is actually why I'm shocked that you put this in your list, because I remember how passionately irritated you were. So are you going to tell me that in 20 years you've softened on that too?
No, I have it in my notes about what I don't like about the movie, and I still don't like the ending. The two things that I still don't like about the way the movie ended was when they come back from World War II time and go into World War, or the current day, and he's standing by, Private Ryan is standing by Captain Miller's grave, and he's going through that experience. I hated the morph technique. That really, I think that set me off, and probably is why I liked the following stuff afterwards, because I would have liked it more if they just did like a quick camera move off and came back and he was old, or did some cut to the grave and come back to him and then he's old. The whole movie was very gritty and real, treated very kind of real, right? And then the morph to me has always been this sort of high-tech, wow you kind of effect.
Yeah.
And I just felt like I didn't like it being there. It took me totally out because all of a sudden I felt like I'm watching a special effect. And a point where I'm supposed to just appreciate that, oh, this is not the captain, this is Private Ryan old. But instead they morphed him right in front of my eyes as if to tell me, just to make sure you're not sure who you're looking at, we're going to make sure it's absolutely clear that we're going to morph from him to the old man. It's the same guy. I really didn't like that. I still don't like it. I wish they had shot it differently. I just don't like it.
It works well for Michael Jackson's black and white video, but not awesome. For Saving Private Ryan.
Yeah, I really didn't like the use of that, and I'll stand to that I still don't like it. And then I think that just set me off to where when he started, asking, did I do okay and all that, I was already like pissed. So then I didn't appreciate the thing after that. If they didn't do the morph, I might have been more forgiving with that. It really was the morph. The morph got me mad, and then it just felt like insult to injury when it got to his line, because I was already like, yeah, he took me out. I'm already not liking this scene. So
that's why I was thinking all along, I know that won't be in your top 5 because of how passionate you were about that ending and how it disgusted you. So that's why I'm still surprised it's your number 2, because I have such a memory of you going off outside the cinema, which usually you don't go off. And you did.
But understand this though, is that and a lot of times an ending to a movie can ruin a whole film. Right? We talked about that. The third act, you can have a great first act to set it up, a great second act to build to a climax, and the third act just throws up all over itself. But this was fine through the third act. It was just the end scene. And I think why I was so mad is that I enjoyed the movie up to that point. And it's like, why'd you have to ruin it with a morph? Everything was great till the morph. And so it wasn't like the movie itself was bad, it had a bad ending. It was a good ending with a bad special effect thrown in there. So it wasn't enough to ruin my feeling of where the movie ranked. It was just the last thing you heard me complaining about coming out of the theater. But there was a lot of good stuff that led up to the end and just not the end scene that I still enjoyed the movie a lot. But yes, it's not perfect. That's why it's not number 1, because there were certain things that bugged me. So yeah, the fact that I had to leave with some complaining is why it got knocked down to number 2.
All right, so I guess we'll hit my number 1 and finish out our top 5 war movies. I do have an honorable mention. I assume you do too.
I do too. Yeah. Well, okay, and go ahead.
All right. So my number 1 I've talked about before, probably not a big surprise to you, is from 1989. It's called Glory.
Which is my honorable mention.
Following the Battle of Antietam, Colonel Robert Gould Shaw is offered command of the United States' first all-African American regiment, the 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry. With Junior Officer Cabot Forbes, Shaw puts together a strong and proud unit, including the escaped slave Tripp and the wise gravedigger John Rawlins. At first limited to manual tasks, the regiment fights to be placed in the heat of battle. Directed by Edward Zwick, starring Matthew Broderick, Ferris Bueller, as we all know, as Robert Gould Shaw, Denzel Washington as Private Silas Tripp, Cary Elves as Major Cabot Forbes, and Morgan Freeman as Sergeant Major John Rawlins. I've seen this movie so many times, and they just released it on 4K disc last fall, which I took that as the perfect time to show it to my son Brett as an important historical memory of the Civil War and what it was like during that time. I think when you compare Glory to like other war movies like Vietnam, especially like the Platoon movies, I think about back in many of the wartime films that took place in later wars like Vietnam War, World War II. They had the draft. Okay, many of the people who fought were drafted. They were sent to fight, and they didn't want to. If you got drafted, you had to go. But Glory, these people volunteered. They wanted to fight, and they died for it. And that's why this movie had such an impact on me, because I got so attached to the characters And at the end, it had an unhappy non-Hollywood ending. They all died. They gave their lives to do something that they felt was right. And there's a really wonderful talk between Tripp and Robert Shaw about, what happens after the war? What do we do? What happens? I mean, you're a white guy. You go back to your nice house, your life. He said, but what about us? What do we do? And Robert Shaw says, that rather stinks, doesn't it? He says, well, what should we do? And Tripp says, we ante up and kick in, sir. We ante up and kick in. And that means make a name for themselves, be remembered, do something worth remembrance. And so they volunteer to be the first to attack a very difficult fort, and they all die. And I remember that was very impactful for me at the end, how that happened. So that's why Glory to me, there's so much about it, I think, that talks about what it means to give up your life. And I can't say I could have been one of those people. I cherished my life. I mean, I was always afraid of being drafted during the Iraqi war. I thought that I might get drafted, and that had instilled fear in me like I'd never felt in my life. But these people, they volunteered, and what a different way of thinking that I can't relate to. So that's why nothing but respect for Glory. And then, can't forget James Horner and his wonderful score. Love his score in this movie. Just great music. So, all right.
I knew this was going to be your number one. And to be honest, this is why 1917 is not my honorable mention. And I put this one in here. This is a movie that I feel, for me personally, let me ask you, when you watched it, did you see it when it came out?
I did. I saw it in the theater.
Okay.
It had a huge impact on me.
This suffered from bad timing for me. I believe if I'd seen it like you did when it came out in 89, I probably would have loved it as much as you did. The problem was I missed it. I didn't see it for whatever reason. I remember we had at our house where I was roommates with Rob and all the other guys during the college days, we had a big cardboard standee of Glory in our hallway. It was huge. It took the whole hallway space. We used to get all kinds of throwaways from the local Crazy Mike's video rental store. They'd have, once they're done with all their cardboard displays, they would just junk it. And we went down there and they said, can we keep these? And like, yeah, it's all going to the garbage anyway. So we'd raid their throwaways and we'd decorate our whole house with all the movie memorabilia stuff that they were throwing out. And Glory was this big 8 foot wide, 10 feet wide by 6 foot tall thing with the title on it. And it was really cool. And I remember looking at it going, I wonder if that movie's any good. And I never saw it. I just never saw it. And I feel like if I had, it probably would have been a really impactful movie. Unfortunately, I didn't see it until you got me to see it, which was sometime post Braveheart. And Braveheart, unfortunately, ruined the impact that Glory probably would have had. That movie came after Platoon, but this wasn't a movie you would compare to Platoon or any of the Vietnam movies. This is a older generational, fought on American soil, the two infantries coming together. It's a very different type of movie that you don't even put in the category to me with the Vietnam movies and stuff like that. So I'm kind of sad that I didn't get that because since then I have watched it. I watched it with you and I might have seen it again. I've been trying to get my kids to watch it and because I have a copy that you gave to me. We still haven't watched it because every time I try to bring it up, it has not been the right time. There hasn't been quite the excitement.
That's from olden days.
It's olden days. And I want to show it to them because right now Vanessa's studying the Civil War and it's all about that in this movie. And so I'm still planning to have them watch it because I still think they'll get something out of it, at least educationally as well. But yeah, for me, it's good. I remember the great cast. Denzel Washington, we've been watching a lot of his movies lately, and he's such a good actor. And he's good in that film, too. And music's great. I think I got to know the music a lot more than even the movie itself, because for a while we were editing a lot of our football highlight videos with that music. So I got to know that music a lot more than any of the scenes in the film.
Well, what's nice about it is we talk about James Horner ripping himself off through many, many movies. Star Trek Wrath of Khan always sounded like Battle Beyond the Stars. sounding like Enemy at the Gates. But
Yeah.
his music in Glory, there's none of that. It's very original to me.
Yeah, true. James Horner does some great stuff. A lot of choir voices in that music, and so yeah. I know it's good. I know it won several Oscars and had a lot of Academy Awards. So I know that you're not the only one who likes this movie. I just felt like I missed the boat, and I'm sad about that because Braveheart came along and became my favorite of armies charging at each other movies. It's hard to go back sometimes when you've got an impact from one thing and then you try to go back and watch it. Like I said, same thing with Apocalypse. Apocalypse, if I had probably seen it when it came out, would have had a higher impact and probably landed in a higher spot. But Platoon did what Apocalypse didn't get the chance to do. And I think Braveheart did to me what Glory might have done. But because it didn't, that's why Glory ended up on my lower scale, because I did not watch it in the theater like you did. And I think it's really important, these movies that are like this, that, like I said, for me, it's the disturbing factor or something that's really moving in a way that it just has a strong effect. And all these movies that did for me were ones that I watched them at the time they came out. It's hard to go back and reverse engineer. Okay, let me
what
go
I
back
find
to what
interesting
I was like 89.
about watching Glory these days is since Glory has been out and I've seen it so many times and I've learned so much about the making of the movie, the thing I find the most fascinating is that Matthew Broderick and Carrie Elves, who played best friends in the movie, did not get along at all making the movie. They pretty much hated each other. And so I always find it fascinating to see two actors who play friends in a movie talking to each other as good friends, but then thinking when the camera yells cut, they're both like, don't want to be around you anymore.
That's a sign of a good actor. You can put all that aside and make you believe one thing and it's completely the other.
Well, you have got to sit your girls down to watch this movie.
We will. It'll happen. I think that there's still that scene. I talk about the disturb factor, and there's still that scene that I joke with you every once in a while, where there's Matthew Broderick early in the movie where he's sitting there getting tended to because he's got some kind of superficial wound on his neck, and he's watching another guy behind a curtain getting his leg amputated, and the guy is screaming, "Don't cut anymore, please! Don't cut anymore!" And you can hear the sawing going on, and that bothered me. And it lingered and has stayed with me to now, and it takes a lot to do that. So again, Glory hit me up with that one. So that was definitely a disturbing scene. So I like to be disturbed. It takes a lot to do that, but when they do, I always tip my cap and go, okay, you guys got me with that one. You got me squeamish. So that's why that one ended up on my honorable mention. So now
we should keep moving. I'm looking at the time of the show. We're at an hour and a half. So
okay, well, it's not the longest yet, but it's going to get there. All right. So what's yours?
Honorable mention?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, my honorable mention, I have briefly discussed this movie before, but it's Inglourious Bastards from 2009. I just love this movie. And again, Quentin Tarantino has made so many great films. It is the first year of Germany's occupation of France. Allied officer Lieutenant Aldo Rain assembles a team of Jewish soldiers to commit violent acts of retribution against the Nazis, including the taking of their scalps. He and his men joined forces with Brigitte von Hammersmark, a German actress and undercover agent, to bring down the leaders of the Third Reich. Their fates converge with theater owner Shoshana Dreyfus, who seeks to avenge the Nazis' execution of her family. This movie is one that I will probably watch every 2 to 3 years because it's so entertaining, and I find it so fascinating the way Quentin Tarantino told this story. And of course, this is the movie that made Christoph Waltz a star. He plays Hans Landa in the movie, and no one knew who Christoph Waltz was before Inglourious Bastards, and now everybody knows who he is, because when he shows up in a movie, I'm already smiling, thinking I'm gonna like this movie because he's in it, because I just like him. He has a way about him that just sucks me in. So he made this movie, and even Quentin Tarantino talked about how he had a really hard time casting Hans, and Christoph, when he found Christoph, he felt like he saved this film. He said because he felt at one point that the character of Hans Landa was an impossible cast, that just he couldn't find someone who could pull it off, and he did. So, Norb, I don't know how well you remember this movie, but How do you order 3 whiskeys in Germany?
Well, I did see this movie recently.
So you know.
With my kids, so it's actually still in my brain. If I recall correct, I think it's that, isn't it?
No, this is the way you do it in American. In Germany, it's your thumb and 2 fingers. So, isn't that interesting? I would have never known that.
Yeah, that's the tense scene in the bar where you got this German officer who's suspectful of these guys who are impersonating German soldiers, and he starts to observe them in a very only way Tarantino can do it, tense way, and the final giveaway was that is how he raised raised the 3 fingers or the thumb and 2 fingers to order the drink, and that's what gave him away. But
that was his tell.
So I'm curious so I watched this. The whole family watched this together. So, do you think my kids liked it or didn't like it?
I'm guessing they didn't. My son loved it.
They liked it. They liked it a lot. I was surprised.
Oh, good. That's right. You're starting to watch a lot of Quentin Tarantino movies with them, aren't you?
Yes, a few. A couple. Just a couple. We watched Kill Bill together, and then we watched this one. And they just got a kick out of, what's the actor's name? Christoph
Waltz.
Christoph Waltz. Yeah, they loved him. There's so many moments I'd forgotten, little subtle things that he would do that were really hilarious. And
he's friendly and terrifying at the same time.
Yeah. And
bad guy.
And not just friendly, but funny. He's hilarious. It's subtle little things that he does with his finger. And the girls had a great laugh. And Brad Pitt was funny. And only Tarantino can combine ultra violence with suspense and laughter all in the same scene.
Yeah, only he has done that well.
And this movie did bounce around as well. And the pinballs shuffling of those last couple spots, this bounced around up there with Glory in 1917, and unfortunately ended up on the cutting room floor. But I agree with you there. This is definitely, I'm glad I watched it again, and I'm glad my kids got to watch it. And it's a great piece of film. We're looking forward to more Tarantino films. This definitely is a good one worth mentioning.
Buongiorno. All right.
DiGiorno. Yeah.
DiGiorno. Yeah, Brad Pitt's terrible Italian accent.
Yeah.
All right. What is your honorable mention?
No, I already said it was Glory.
Oh, I forgot. Right.
So,
all right.
Like I said, you knocked off a lot of my movies off my list. We did it. We're at the end. So, what's the surprise?
All right. Well, the surprise is actually a dedication. I thought I would share with you a little bit of history about my grandfather, Oliver Hess. He was a lieutenant commander during World War II and was stationed in Lakehurst, New Jersey. He flew blimps, and that's an interesting thing in itself is the idea of a blimp. I mean, the blimps were used back then in World War II. Nowadays, you just see them over football stadiums. So he flew military blimps, and he received the Air Medal of Honor Award for bravery above and beyond the call of duty because he was sent on a mission in the dark of night in the midst of a snowstorm under extremely hazardous flight conditions to test an anti-icing substance on the blimp windows. He would then radio results and personal observations back to the command center. The 3-hour mission was successful, and the de-icer was used to save future B-24 flights and the men aboard. Previously in the war, many B-24 planes iced over at a certain altitude, and the result, the pilots had zero visibility out of the windshield, and many planes crashed. We all understand the concept of de-icing. When you take a commercial flight, they have to de-ice your plane, the wings, so it'll not fall out of the sky after it takes off. So my grandpa flew a blimp mission in a terrible storm to test this de-icing substance and make it fit for B-24 planes. In addition, he piloted a blimp that was his blimp called Big Mike. Funny name, my name, Big Mike. That was the blimp's name on May 14th, 1945 to force the surrender of the first enemy German Nazi submarine off of Cape May, New Jersey. I never knew him. He died before I was born. So all I know is these stories, but it's neat to hear about what he did in the war. And I still find it fascinating it's something I don't quite understand is how a blimp can make a submarine surrender. I guess maybe the submarine had to submerge Maybe it was out of gas, or it was surrounded. So maybe it went up, and then the blimp was part of the American force to basically, take it into custody, so to speak. That's my best guess. You know what I mean? The concept of a blimp making a sub surrender. It's an interesting thing to kind of get your head wrapped around.
Yeah, that would be an interesting movie itself, because I don't think we see a whole lot of the uses of blimps in World War II movies. I think about Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. Remember?
That's all I think of. No ticket.
His dad got no ticket, and a really bad blue screen blimp scene as they go taking off in the plane that comes out of that. But
you think about the Hindenburg.
But yeah, as far as World War II battles, you don't really think of the blimp being used in it. So that's pretty fascinating that your grandfather was actually a pilot of one of those.
Yeah. So it's an honor to share a little bit of my memory of him and his history, because again, otherwise, how will we be remembered? We're remembered for the things we do in life, and these are things he did in life. And by me talking about it now, it's a way to remember him and something he did, which nowadays is a long time ago.
Well, and I have
about 75 years ago.
Yeah. Well, I have a similar story also about my grandfather. I don't have nearly the detail that you have, but I do know that my dad's dad, he was a Norberto Santiago. Technically, I'm the third, because he was Norberto, my dad is Norberto, and I'm Norb, so third in the line. But he fought in World War II against the Japanese. Unfortunately, he went missing in action and was never found. So I never met my grandfather either. What I do remember, and my grandmother was, she lived to be with us to her early 80s before she passed away. But she used to tell us stories. She didn't really have much about stories about him because he was off fighting, but I remember stories that she told us about with my dad, and my dad was the youngest. He was, just like, not quite a baby, but, an infant or toddler. And she remembered stories. She would tell us about stories about the Japanese searching through the villages and taking prisoners. And I remember they told me the story about how they all were hiding amongst the trees and the dirt when the Japanese came out, because they would find little babies and they would throw them in the air and machete them like a skewer. And if my grandma had been caught, my dad probably would have ended up on the end of one of those blades. And so luckily they never got caught. They survived, and otherwise I wouldn't exist. So pretty scary stories. Even my dad was too young to really remember the details, but my grandmother was alive long enough to share some of those horrible stories of what they went through back in World War II when the Japanese were obviously, the Philippines were a strategic part of the Japanese Pacific, control and strategic area. So a lot of people, a lot of Filipinos lost their lives either as civilians or as fighting with the Americans to try to, keep the Japanese from occupying the country. So pretty scary stuff, but it is nice to be able to honor them and remember them when we can, especially with Memorial Day just having passed recently. So yeah, that's good stuff. I've never heard you speak of your grandfather that way. So that's very interesting. Maybe someday.
Well, I have my mom to thank for helping get me some of this information so I can make sure I talked about it accurately and factually. So thank you, Mom, for helping out.
All right. Well, that wraps up our top 5 war movies. Thanks again for making it through the journey and the battle with us. For those of you who are watching on YouTube, thank you for watching, and please like the videos, subscribe, hit that notification bell so that you'll be notified of future videos. And for all of you who are listening on podcast, thank you for your support, and we hope you'll be around for our future shows. I'm Norb.
And I'm Mike.
And we are The Watchmen.
Thanks for watching. We will see you next time.
Thanks for watching The Watchmen.
Please click on here to watch other episodes, and be sure to hit that like button too.
And please subscribe and hit that notification bell. That way you'll always be alerted to any future episodes.
It really helps us out, and we appreciate it.
We'll see you next time. And remember, we'll be watching.